Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Entheon's channel. We're sitting here once again with Tim, and we wanted to dive into just a discussion around the psychedelic industry as a whole, kind of knock some questions around. Tim, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing pretty wonderful. So, I guess the first thing I wanted to kind of softball to you was to talk about physiological versus behavioral addictions and how psychedelics could potentially help them, if there's any differences in how it could help them or roadblocks along the way for either one.
Yeah, no, totally. That's a very great question, and it's inherently complex. In terms of the physical addictions to things like, whether it's methamphetamine, alcohol, tobacco, or opiates, it is all premised on, to my understanding, I'm not a behavioral psychologist or anything, so you'll have to take everything with a grain of salt, but it is all premised on, of course, there are specific drug dependency related issues, but the majority of what actually drives addictions are often centered in the psychology, right? Like there's an inherent, drug effect that is tied to these various substances. But the reality is that ultimately, I think there's a lot of literature about this. The what drives drug addiction is ultimately a sense of distress or unmet needs that ultimately, things like opiates and amphetamines and things can solve. In a lot of ways, people are inherently self-medicating, and people don't medicate, inherently good positions in life, but for, sort of most cases are medicating a sense of distress or unmet needs that drugs satisfy. And so a lot of that, aside from the physical dependency part, is, psychological in nature. And so, diving into that, the complexity about what makes a person in distress or dissatisfied really does sort of boil down to that underlying sense of, perception of the world, a feeling of distress that may be related to a lack of meaning, a lack of fulfillment, a sense of isolation, loneliness, sadness. And I think that's where the really, transformative nature of psychedelics like DMT comes into play. It's in addressing that, right? It's in addressing and instilling a sense of meaning that may be lost.
Mhm.
And so, I think a lot of the most obvious ways that people have of dealing with a sense of isolation, loneliness, distress are, of course, with things like alcohol, opiates, and other substances. But we do find that people are also engaged in other ways of distracting or, diverting their attention away from that sense of loneliness. So we have a variety of other behavioral addictions, whether it's process addictions related to, media consumption, social media consumption, sort of addictive, gambling behaviors or sex behaviors. Those things do fulfill something that for individuals that are, seeking that thrill or that catharsis is being unmet. So again, we do think that DMT and drugs like it are potentially hugely effective in addressing that. If you address the core and you sort of nourish the root of a person, then you can ultimately help to prevent them from seeking the interventions or behavioral maladaptive practices that they use to soothe themselves.
Yep, that's a really good point. And I guess one of the key things that really shows something is an addiction is when it becomes detrimental to you. But a lot of these people start it as a way to self-medicate. That's a really good point. But they get caught in that vicious cycle of using it, and that can cause a lot of problems. And with the self-medication, you see ties between addiction of all sorts of things and mental illness as well, as they don't have an actual way to let's say talk to a therapist or receive medications to treat them in that way. So I guess people left to their own devices kind of look for something that can just help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's an interesting one. Like with sex addiction, for instance, it may not be physiologically harmful to you, but there are, consequences in terms of life and priorities and things like that, where things can, of course, get, dangerous. But it's an interesting one too, because it's not like a chemical dependency, but it is certainly an addiction that becomes quite detrimental over time. And so, and that's another example of the complexity of addiction, right? Addiction isn't purely a physiological demand that's for a like opiates where there's a withdrawal attached to it, but ultimately that type of addiction that's founded in, I think it could be argued a largely emotional basis, is indicative of the idea that, addictions aren't always based on drug dependency, but also are based on a dependency to the sense of elation or a sense of relief or stress management that comes with, types of actions associated with a unmet need.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. It's almost like what's interesting with the physiological ones is while it technically isn't an addiction to an outside substance, it is still addicted to that thrill or that reward system in your brain being hit. So it's still not really great for you as you get addicted to that kind of thing. Gambling, like sex, gambling's a little worse, I guess, in terms of like it can ruin your whole life really quickly.
Yeah.
Sex addiction can also ruin your life really quickly. It's not as bad as a substance, as in like there isn't a definitive end to it
Mhm.
as substances
Sure.
have. Would you say it's easier to curb physiological addictions or the psychological addictions then?
I think that's a really complex one to ask, or one to answer. I think often, with sort of addictions to substances, I guess the magnitude of the problem becomes quite acute and addressable, or acute and quite obvious. In the case of people with opiate addictions, as well as other hard drug addictions and alcoholism, the consequences can mount fairly quickly. We have people that are suffering from, all the associated health risks, overdoses, cirrhosis of the liver, things of that nature, where it becomes almost a medical necessity that the person stop. So, that sense of obviousness and urgency is presented. But then there are certain complicators, of course, from years of hardcore addiction. On the other hand, yeah, behavioral addictions, it is sometimes a bit more insidious. It's a bit harder to define. That being said, determining which one's easier to harder to solve is an inherently difficult question to answer. But I do think the reality is that, like, premising the treatment less on what the sort of specific behavioral outcome is, but really centering on the fact that whatever the addiction is, and sometimes people have a concurrent number of addictions. I know a good number of drug users that are also engaged in other types of behavioral addictions, whether it's gambling or sex. I do think the importance is not centering on what the specific behavioral outcome is, but really focusing on the acknowledgement that at the core of all addictions are some unmet needs that need to be addressed, and that I think DMT and psychedelics are really appropriate in answering. Yeah, I think that's the answer I'm going with.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, you're right. It's kind of like a case by case basis. Just saying one's easier to treat over the other. It's more than likely not a realistic thing to say. Would you say then, because you mentioned people having an addiction tend to have multiple, would this be where the term they have an addictive personality comes from, where like they tend to reach out and grab onto things quite easily because like it's not the things themselves, but something at the core of them that they need to work on?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, the that whole notion of addictive personality, I think if you were to do a deeper analysis of that, there were probably some trauma elements or some areas in that person's life. And trauma can be widely defined. It's not necessarily an acute event, but I think trauma, as Gabor Mate has described it, is a prolonged period of time where needs go unmet. And so some of those needs, if they go unmet long enough, can create a sustained state of fear, or a sense that those needs will continuously go unmet, and so that can inherently be traumatic over the course of a certain amount of time. And so, yeah, I do think that idea of the addictive behavior is, or the addictive personality. If you were to pull the covers off of that, you would see that that person's internal composition is maybe comprised of the fact that, on a consistent basis, that person is generally dissatisfied or insecure in terms of need fulfillment. And from that place of insecurity around need fulfillment, they will seek out situations and substances that will give them, whether it's a feeling of love, a feeling of thrill or enticement, or of satisfaction, seeking that out to satisfy something that's unmet for them.
All right. Well, Tim, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom on it. Really appreciate it. Really shine some light. If anyone has any questions, don't be afraid to shoot them over to us. We'll be happy to answer them. Tim, look forward to the next exciting update from Entheon. Take it easy.